My name's Julia Stevens. I'm 26 years old, and 12 years ago today, my parents abandoned me at an airport because of a brutal lie. They had no idea I've been tracking their every move ever since. The smell of damp cedar and wood smoke always reminds me of the day my life ended, and the day it truly began. In coastal Oregon, the rain doesn't just fall, it colonizes. It seeps into your bones, your floorboards, and your temperament. At 15, I was used to the gray. I was a straight-A student with sun-bleached blonde hair that I usually kept in a messy ponytail, and hands that were perpetually stained with ink from my AP history notes, or grease from my shift at the local diner. "Marissa, stop scowling. You'll get wrinkles before you're 20, my mother, Elena, said without looking up from the stove. She was humming a tune I didn't recognize, her movements light, almost girlish. I looked at her, really looked at her. She was beautiful in a fragile way, like a piece of glass that had been glued back together too many times. For years, it had been just us. We were a team. We shared cheap pizza on Friday nights and complained about the drafty windows of our small, salt-fretted house. Then came Rick. He was sitting at our small laminate kitchen table, his heavy work boots scuffing the linoleum I'd spent Saturday scrubbing. He was a thick-necked man with eyes that never quite met mine, always sliding away like oil on water. "Let the girl be, Elena," Rick said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He took a slow sip of his beer, his eyes tracking me as I reached for a glass of water. "She's just at that age, thinks she knows better than everyone else. Don't you, princess?" I didn't answer. I could feel the prickle of heat on the back of my neck. I knew his type. He was a predator who had found a soft place to land. My mother was that soft place. "I'm going to my room to study," I muttered, turning away. "Wait," Mom said, turning around. She held a small, weathered envelope. My heart gave a tiny, unexplained thud. That was the emergency fund, the cash she'd been squirreling away for her dental surgery. "Marissa, have you seen the rest of the rent money? I put the extra $50 in here this morning." I shook my head. "No, I haven't touched it." I caught a glimpse of Rick. He wasn't looking at the beer anymore. He was looking at me, a tiny, jagged smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. It was the look of a man who had already won a game I didn't even know we were playing. "Are you sure?" Rick asked, leaning back so the chair legs creaked ominously. "Because I saw you poking around the kitchen drawers earlier while your mom was in the shower. You looked nervous." "I was looking for a highlighter, Rick. You know that," I snapped. "Marissa, don't use that tone with him," Mom sighed, but her eyes were darting to the envelope, then back to me. A seed of doubt had been planted. I could see it taking root in the lines around her mouth. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window pane in its frame like a desperate ghost trying to get in. I didn't know it yet, but the storm was already inside. The roar of the jet engines faded into a haunting silence, even though the terminal was screaming with life. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, my breath fogging the glass as I watched a silver bird lift into the smoggy Los Angeles sky. My father was on that plane. My life was on that plane. I looked down at my phone. The blue dot was moving. It was ascending, crossing the coastline, heading toward the Pacific. It was the only thing I had left of them, and it was the only thing I had control over. "Honey, are you okay? Where are your parents?" The voice belonged to an airline agent, a woman with a kind face and a name tag that read Brenda. She smelled like peppermint and looked at my yellow dress with a frown. "They're on that plane," I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. I didn't cry. The tears had turned into something hard and cold in my chest, like a stone. "They aren't coming back for me." The next few hours were a blur of fluorescent lights and hushed voices. I was moved from the gate to a small, windowless office and eventually to a police station that smelled of wet asphalt and burnt coffee. I didn't tell them about the app. I didn't tell them about the tracker hidden in the lining of Evelyn's Louis Vuitton suitcase. That was my secret, my tether. By midnight, I was in a car driven by a social worker named Sarah. She kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, trying to offer me a granola bar I wouldn't touch. "We're going to a temporary group home, Julia," she said softly. "It's a safe place. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." The group home was a Victorian house in Pasadena that had seen better days. The wallpaper was peeling like sunburned skin, and the air was thick with the scent of industrial-strength lemon cleaner. I was given a narrow bed in a room shared with 2 other girls who were already asleep, their breathing heavy and rhythmic. I didn't sleep. I climbed under the thin, scratchy wool blanket and pulled my phone out. The screen's glow was blinding in the dark. The blue dot had stopped. They were in Honolulu, a luxury resort on the beach. I could see the satellite view, the turquoise pools, the palm trees, the private villas. I imagined Evelyn sipping a cocktail, laughing at something my father said, while he tried to forget the daughter he'd discarded like a piece of trash. "What you looking at?" I jumped, nearly dropping the phone. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the hall light. He was older, with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything twice. This was Leo, the night supervisor. "You're the girl from the airport," Sarah told me. He looked at my phone, then back at me. "You've got a knack for tech, don't you? Most kids are on TikTok. You were looking at a map interface I haven't seen before." I stayed silent, clutching the phone to my chest. Leo sat on the edge of a vacant chair. "I used to be a private investigator," Leo said, leaning back. "I know a tracking look when I see it. You aren't just sad, Julia. You're watching." I looked at him, really looked at him. For the first time since the terminal, I didn't feel like a ghost. They lied about me. They left me with $50 and a suitcase full of nothing. Leo nodded slowly. "The world is full of people who lie to get what they want, but the digital world? That doesn't lie. Data is the only thing that stays honest." He stood up and tapped the top of my phone. "Keep your secrets, kid, but if you're going to watch them, learn to do it right. Don't just follow the dot. Learn to see what the dot is doing." That night, as the blue pulse flickered on the screen, I made myself a promise. I wasn't just going to survive the system. I was going to become the shadow they could never shake. I was 14, abandoned and alone, but I was the only one who knew how this story was going to end.
12 years is a long time to hold your breath. In New York, the air doesn't smell like jet fuel. It smells like ozone, hot pavement, and the metallic tang of the subway. I stood in my office on the 42nd floor of a glass and steel needle in Midtown, watching the rain streak against the window. My reflection looked back at me, a woman in a sharp charcoal gray blazer, my blonde hair pulled back into a knot so tight it was almost aggressive. I wasn't the girl in the yellow sundress anymore. I was Julia Stevens, senior consultant at Aegis Cybersecurity. People paid me 6 figures to find the cracks in their lives before someone else did. "Julia, the audit for the Mercer account is ready for your final sign-off," my assistant, Marcus, said as he leaned into my office. "Leave it on the tablet, Marcus. I'll look at it before I head out," my voice cool and steady. As soon as the door clicked shut, the professional mask dropped. I sat at my desk and tapped a specific sequence on my haptic keyboard. 3 monitors shifted instantly. The spreadsheets and security logs vanished, replaced by a dark interface that I had spent a decade perfecting. I called it the shadow. The blue dot was still there. It had evolved from a simple GPS tag into a comprehensive digital footprint. I didn't just know where Evelyn and my father were, I knew their credit card transactions, their Netflix history, and their heart rates via their smartwatch data. I watched Evelyn's dot move through an upscale boutique in San Francisco. She was spending money like it was a sport. But today, something was different. A red flag flickered on my secondary screen, a notification from a script I'd written to monitor my father's primary retirement accounts. Transfer pending, $250,000. Destination, Shell Corp, L Sun Holdings. Location, Grand Cayman. My fingers flew across the keys. I traced the routing numbers, my heart hammering a rhythm against my ribs that felt like a ghost of my 14-year-old self. "What are you doing, Evelyn?" I whispered. I dug deeper, bypassing the basic encryption of the shell company. It took me 20 minutes to peel back the layers, and when I did, the breath left my lungs. Al Sun Holdings wasn't a real company. The account holder was Evelyn's maiden name. She wasn't just spending his money, she was gutting him. She was siphoning the Stevens family legacy into a private vault, penny by digital penny. I pulled up my father's health data. His resting heart rate had been climbing for weeks. His pharmaceutical orders showed a spike in blood pressure medication and a new prescription for a heavy-duty sedative. Evelyn was draining his bank account while he was too sick or too drugged to notice. I leaned back, the blue light of the monitors washing over my face. For 12 years, I had stayed in the shadows. I had watched them live their perfect, stolen life, while I fought through the foster system and worked 3 jobs to put myself through MIT. I told myself that watching was enough, that knowing the truth was my protection. But watching a theft is one thing, watching a slow-motion murder is another. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was an automated alert. My father's location had changed. He wasn't at the house. He was at the Mercy West Medical Center, emergency room. I looked at the picture on my desk, the only one I had. It was a Polaroid of me and my dad before Evelyn, taken at a pier. We were both laughing. I hadn't looked at it in years, but I'd kept it in a locked drawer. I closed the shadow. I stood up and grabbed my coat, the heavy wool feeling like armor. "Marcus," I called out as I strode toward the elevator. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the week." "Where are you going?" he asked, startled. "To handle a legacy issue," I said. The elevator doors slid shut, reflecting a woman who was no longer just watching. I was going back to the beginning, and this time, I wasn't the one being left behind.
The hospital didn't smell like the airport. It smelled of bleached floors, latex, and the slow, humming vibration of machines keeping people from the edge. I stood in the doorway of room 412 at Mercy West, my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets to hide the fact that they were shaking. 12 years. My father looked like a wax figure melting into the white sheets. His hair, once thick and chestnut, was now a translucent silver, clinging to a scalp that looked too small for his head. He looked fragile, like a dry leaf that would crumble if I breathed too hard. "The paperwork is almost ready, Mark," a voice purred. I stepped back into the shadow of the hallway. Evelyn was sitting by the bed, her back to the door. Even in a hospital, she was draped in luxury, a cashmere wrap the color of oatmeal, and a diamond watch that caught the clinical overhead light. She was holding a pen, hovering over a clipboard. "I just need you to sign the power of attorney for the estate," she said, her voice dripping with a fake, honeyed concern that made my skin crawl. "The doctors say you need rest, and the New Horizons facility is so much quieter than the house. You won't have to worry about the business anymore." "Quiet," my father wheezed. His voice was a ghost of the one that had shouted at me in the terminal. Is it expensive?" "Don't worry about the cost, darling. We have plenty. I've managed everything." I felt a surge of cold fury. New Horizons wasn't a luxury retreat. I'd looked it up on the flight over. It was a budget care home 3 counties away, notorious for its hands-off approach. She was preparing to dump him there like unwanted luggage, just like they had done to me. I turned away before I could scream. I had to play this right. If I walked in now as Julia, she'd have security remove me before I could blink. I wasn't a daughter today. I was a predator. I walked down to the hospital cafeteria, sat at a corner table, and opened my laptop. I pulled up the investor profile I'd spent the last 48 hours fabricating. J.S. Spencer, CEO of North Star Acquisitions. I sent an email to the official address of Stevens Real Estate, the business my father had built from nothing. I knew the company was hemorrhaging cash because Evelyn had been treating it like her personal ATM. Subject: urgent inquiry regarding the West Side Development Project. Message: I understand your firm is looking for a primary investor to prevent the upcoming foreclosure. I will be in town for 48 hours. Let's discuss a buyout. I hit send. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Evelyn's private account. Miss Spencer, I am the acting director of Stevens Real Estate while my husband is indisposed. I would be delighted to meet. Would tomorrow evening at our estate work? We are hosting a small charity event. It would be the perfect time for a private conversation. I stared at the screen. A charity event. She was throwing a party while my father lay in a hospital bed signing his life away. Perfect, I whispered. I looked up at the television hanging in the corner of the cafeteria. A news report was playing on mute, showing a storm brewing off the coast. The gray clouds looked heavy and bloated. I took a sip of the bitter, lukewarm coffee. I thought about the $50 bill my father had shoved into my hand. I thought about the cold linoleum of the airport floor. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, black device, no bigger than a thumb drive. It was a signal interceptor. If I could get this into their home network tomorrow night, I wouldn't just be tracking her location. I would own every word she spoke, every text she sent, and every secret she thought she'd buried. I wasn't just watching the blue dot anymore. I was moving in for the kill.
The morning of the gala, the sky over the Stevens estate was a bruised purple, heavy with the scent of an impending storm. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my hotel suite, adjusting the cuff of my sleeve. I wasn't wearing a yellow sundress today. I was wearing a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that flowed like liquid envy. It was a color that commanded attention, a color that said I had never known a day of hunger in my life. I ran a hand over my hair, which was styled in sleek, cold waves that caught the light like spun glass. I looked expensive. I looked powerful. I looked nothing like the broken girl at gate B4. Time to go to work, I whispered to my reflection. The Stevens estate sat behind massive wrought iron gates at the end of a winding, oak-lined driveway. As the town car crawled forward, the house came into view, a sprawling colonial that used to feel like a kingdom and now just looked like a tomb. The air outside was thick and humid, making the scent of the blooming jasmine along the walkway almost suffocating. It was the same scent Evelyn used to wear. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my designer heels, a sharp, rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown. The party was already in full swing. The sound of a string quartet drifted out from the open French doors, mingling with the polite, hollow laughter of the local elite. I walked through the foyer, my heart thudding a heavy bass line against my ribs. "Miss Spencer, I'm so glad you could make it." The voice hit me like a bucket of ice water. I turned. Evelyn was gliding toward me, a glass of champagne in one hand, her face fixed in a mask of professional warmth. She looked older, the skin around her eyes tight from too many procedures, but the predatory glint in her gaze was exactly the same. "Evelyn Stevens," she said, extending a hand. "Thank you for the interest in our firm. It's been a difficult time with Mark in the hospital." I took her hand. Her skin was dry and cold. She had no idea whose hand she was shaking. She had no idea that the woman standing in front of her was the same girl she'd discarded 12 years ago. "J.S. Spencer," I replied, my voice a smooth, practiced alto. "I'm sorry to hear about your husband, but business waits for no one, does it?" Evelyn's eyes brightened. She liked that. She liked the coldness. "Exactly. Why don't we find somewhere quiet to discuss the initial terms? The study is just this way." As we walked, I felt the weight of the small black interceptor in my clutch. My plan was simple: get into the study, plant the device in the back of the router, and wait for the shadow to do the rest. We stepped into my father's old study. It smelled of old leather and tobacco, scents that used to mean safety to me. Now they just felt like memories of a man who wasn't strong enough to love his own daughter. "Make yourself comfortable," Evelyn said, gesturing to the heavy oak desk. "I'll just go grab the West Side files. I keep them in the safe in the hallway." She turned and left, the click of her heels fading. I moved instantly. I didn't head for the desk. I headed for the server cabinet tucked behind the bookshelf. My fingers moved with surgical precision, unscrewing the back panel of the router. I slid the interceptor into the USB port and watched for the tiny amber light to blink twice. Syncing. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A notification appeared on the darkened screen. Connection established. Accessing private cloud. I heard the floorboards creak outside. I quickly closed the cabinet and smoothed my dress, sitting in the guest chair just as Evelyn walked back in with a thick manila folder. "Here we are," she said, her smile broadening. "I think you'll find the projected returns very enticing." I looked at the folder, but my mind was on the data stream currently flooding my server. Thousands of files, hidden accounts, recorded calls. "I'm sure I will," I said, meeting her gaze with a level of intensity that made her blink. "I'm very interested in seeing what you've been hiding, Evelyn." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "I like you, Miss Spencer. You have a real killer instinct." "You have no idea," I whispered. Evelyn was mid-sentence, detailing the unfortunate depreciation of the West Side property, when her phone chimed. She glanced at it, her expression shifting from professional charm to a sharp, narrowed irritation. "Forgive me, Miss Spencer. It's the catering manager. Apparently, the ice sculpture has begun to melt, and she's having a crisis of spirit. I'll be back in 2 minutes." "Take your time," I said, offering a practiced, vacant smile. "I'll just look through these projections." The moment the door clicked shut, I pulled my phone from my clutch. The screen was a waterfall of white text against a black background. The interceptor was working faster than I'd hoped. It had already bypassed the local firewall and was deep diving into the Stevens Home private cloud. My thumb hovered over a folder labeled Archive 2014. My breath hitched. 2014 was the year of the airport, the year my life was dismantled. I tapped the folder. Inside were subfolders: legal, taxes, household, and then a single file titled J Problem. I felt a cold sweat break out across my collarbone. I opened it. There they were, the brutal lies that had convinced my father I was a sociopath. I saw the original photos of Evelyn's son, bruises she'd painted on his arms with eyeshadow before taking the pictures. I saw the draft emails she'd written to herself from a spoofed account in my name, detailing a plan to get rid of her. But then I found a file that made the room tilt. It was an audio recording. I pressed my phone to my ear, my heart thundering. "Mark is finally convinced," Evelyn's voice rang out, clear and triumphant. She was talking to someone, a man sounding younger. He thinks she's a monster. The airport plan is set for Tuesday. Once she's in the system, her inheritance from her mother stays in the trust, and as her legal guardian, I'll have full access. He's too broken to check the fine print." The man's voice replied, laughing, "You're cold, Evie. What if she tells him the truth?" "He won't listen. I've spent months feeding him stories about her mental instability. By Tuesday, she'll be a memory." I closed my eyes, the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears, drowning out the string quartet outside. It wasn't just about getting me out of the house. It was a heist. My mother had left me a trust fund, money I never knew existed because I was told there was nothing. Evelyn hadn't just stolen my father, she had stolen my mother's final gift to me. A flash of lightning illuminated the study, casting long, jagged shadows across the oak desk. The storm had arrived. I heard the click of the door. I slid my phone back into my clutch just as Evelyn walked back in, looking flustered. "Crisis averted," she sighed, smoothing her hair. "Now, where were we? The buyout. I think a starting figure of $8 million for the West Side plot is more than fair, don't you?" I looked at her. I didn't see the sophisticated woman she pretended to be. I saw the thief. I saw the woman who had stood in a kitchen 12 years ago, recording herself while planning to orphan a child. "I think the price is much higher than that, Evelyn," I said, standing up. I walked toward the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. "In fact, I think the cost of this deal is going to be everything you own." Evelyn paused, the folder halfway to her lap. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold. "I beg your pardon?" "The West Side project is a shell, just like L. Sun Holdings in the Caymans, just like the fake bruises you painted on your son's arms in 2014. The color drained from Evelyn's face as fast as it was watching a ghost materialize. She dropped the folder. The papers scattered across the Persian rug like fallen leaves. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I took a step toward her, the green silk of my dress hissing against the floor. I reached up and unpinned my hair, letting the blonde waves fall around my shoulders, the exact way I used to wear it when I was 14. "You told my father I was a monster," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You told him I was dangerous. You were right about one thing, Evelyn. I am dangerous, but only to you." The house shook with a massive peal of thunder. "Julia?" she breathed, her eyes wide with a terror that was finally, beautifully real. "Hello, Evelyn. I've been watching you for a long time, and it's finally time for the final boarding call."
The storm didn't just stay outside. It felt like it had moved into the room, static electricity prickling the fine hairs on my arms. Evelyn backed away from me, her heels catching on the edge of the rug. Her face was a mask of crumbling plaster. "You're dead," she hissed, her voice a jagged shard of glass. "I made sure you were gone. You're just a ghost, a delusional, bitter girl who—" "I'm the girl who watched you," I interrupted, my voice as calm as the eye of a hurricane. "Every flight, every shopping spree, every secret meeting. I've been the silent passenger in your life for 4,380 days. "Security!" Evelyn shrieked, scrambling for the door. "We have an intruder! Someone call the police!" I didn't stop her. I followed her. I wanted her to run. I wanted her to run right into the trap I had set. We burst out of the study and onto the balcony overlooking the grand ballroom. Below us, 100 of the city's most influential people looked up, champagne glasses frozen at their lips. The string quartet faltered into a discordant silence. "Evelyn, what's going on?" a man called out from the floor. It was the mayor, looking confused.
Evelyn gripped the marble railing, her knuckles white. "This woman, this Ms. Sterling, she's a fraud. She's a stalker who's been harassing my family. Get her out of here." I stepped into the light of the massive crystal chandelier. I pulled my tablet from the hidden pocket of my gown. "She's right about one thing," I said, my voice carrying through the silent hall, amplified by the house's own smart audio system I'd hijacked moments ago. "I am a fraud. My name isn't J.S. Sterling. My name is Julia Stevens, and 12 years ago, the woman standing next to me left a 14-year-old child at LAX with $50 because she wanted a trust fund." A collective gasp rippled through the room. "She's lying!" Evelyn screamed, her voice cracking. "She's mentally ill. Mark told you all years ago." "Let's look at the data, shall we?" I tapped a command on the tablet. The massive projection screens behind the stage, which had been displaying a slideshow of Stevens' family charity work, flickered and died. Then they surged back to life. A map of the world appeared. Thousands of blue lines began to web across the screen, pulsing with light. "This is you, Evelyn. This is every mile you've traveled on my father's dime. And these?" I tapped again. The map vanished, replaced by a ledger. "These are the transfers to L. Sun Holdings, $2 million in the last 6 months alone, all while my father lies in a hospital bed being told he's broke." The room went cold. People began to whisper, eyes darting between the screen and the trembling woman on the balcony. "And finally," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in every corner of the room, I hit the play button. The audio I'd found in the study filled the ballroom. Evelyn's voice, venomous, calculating, and triumphant, boasted about the airport plan and the poisoning lie. The recording was undeniable. It was the sound of a predator caught in her own digital snare. Evelyn looked around the room, but there was no one left to charm. Her friends, her donors, her sycophants, they were all backing away, their faces twisted in disgust. "You ruined me," she whispered, looking at me with a hatred so pure that it was almost beautiful. "No," I said, leaning in close so only she could hear. "You ruined yourself. I just recorded the evidence." The heavy oak front doors swung open. 2 police officers stepped into the foyer, their yellow raincoats dripping on the expensive tile. I had sent the files to the district attorney's office the moment I entered the house. "Evelyn Stevens," the lead officer called out, "we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of grand larceny, wire fraud, and child endangerment." The silence that followed was only broken by the sound of the rain against the skylight. I watched as the handcuffs clicked shut over Evelyn's manicured wrists. She didn't go out with dignity. She kicked and screamed, a hollow, bitter woman finally stripped of her stolen finery. As they led her away, I looked down at my tablet. The blue dot was stationary. The tracking was over. I turned and walked away from the ballroom, away from the stares and the whispers. I had one more stop to make. The storm was finally breaking, and for the first time in 12 years, I could see the stars.
The morning after the gala, the world felt like it had been scrubbed clean. The storm had moved inland, leaving behind a sky so blue it looked painted. I stood in the hospital parking lot, the cool, rain-washed air filling my lungs. For the first time in over a decade, my chest didn't feel tight. The stone was gone. I walked into room 412. The heavy scent of antiseptic was still there, but the predatory presence of Evelyn was a memory. My father was awake. He was propped up on thin pillows, staring out the window at the distant mountains. When he turned to look at me, his eyes weren't filled with the anger I'd lived with for 12 years. They were filled with a hollow, devastating clarity. A tablet lay on his lap. He'd seen the news. He'd heard the recordings. "Julia,"
he whispered. The name sounded strange from him, like a word in a language he had forgotten how to speak. I didn't rush to his side. I stood at the foot of the bed, my hands clasped in front of me. I was the one in control now. "Hello, Dad." I didn't know," he began, his voice cracking. "The things she said, the files she showed me. I was a fool. I let her take you from me." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw a man who had chosen comfort over his own blood. I saw a man who was willing to believe the worst of a 14-year-old girl because it was easier than standing up to the woman in his bed. "You didn't just let her take me," I said, my voice steady and quiet. "You handed me to her. You gave me $50 and told me to find my own way. Do you know what $50 gets a child at an airport, Dad? It gets them a few meals and a lot of fear." He bowed his head, a single tear tracing a path through the deep lines on his face. "I'll make it right. The lawyers, the trust fund, everything Evelyn took, I'll return it tenfold. The business is yours. I'll step down." I looked at the window, at the bright, clear world outside. "I don't want the business, Dad, and I don't need the money. I built a life without you. I became a woman you don't even recognize because I had no other choice." "Please," he sobbed, "don't leave me again." "I'm not leaving you," I said, and for the first time I felt a flicker of pity for him. "I'm just finishing what started 12 years ago. You chose your path that day at the gate. This is me choosing mine." I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I opened the weather app, the interface that had been my only connection to my family for a decade. The blue dot was pulsing right here, in this room. "I tracked you for 12 years, not because I wanted to come back, but because I needed to know when the lie finally caught up to the truth. I needed to be there to see it happen." My thumb hovered over the red delete button in the corner of the app. "Julia, wait!" "Goodbye, Mark," I said. I pressed the button. The map vanished. The server connection severed. The blue pulse that had dictated my life since I was 14 flickered once and went dark. I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't look back at the broken man in the bed. I walked through the corridors, past the nurse's station, and out into the brilliant, blinding sunlight. I pulled my car out of the lot and headed toward the highway. I didn't have a map open. I didn't need to know where anyone else was. For the first time in my life, I wasn't a shadow, and I wasn't a ghost. I was just Julia Stevens, and the road ahead was wide, open, and entirely mine.